So this was a real get for us, thanks to Monica Ragati, who's kind of a friend of the conference, for introducing us to Rayid. So Rayid Ghani was the chief scientist for Obama for America 2012, and he ran the campaign focusing on analytics, technology, data, all that kind of stuff. Looked at improving a lot of the different functions that the campaign was doing and really mobilizing voters using analytics, social media, machine learning. Pretty interesting and pretty controversial topic, and Rayid is obviously someone who spends a lot of time talking about this, so he said, you know, instead of just a presentation, how about we do a little like fireside chat and get into some of those questions. I've got a bunch of questions I'm very eager to ask. I've been waiting for this moment for a while. I know you may have some, so I'm happy to field those. And Rayid, by the way, before that was at Accenture and spends a lot of time advising startups and starting clever things himself. Joining me is Alexander Howard. Alex is the Government 2.0 correspondent for O'Reilly Media. He lives in Washington, D.C., and he writes about the intersection of society, government, the internet, technology, and how technology is being used to help citizens, cities, and national governments solve really large-scale problems. So this is a pretty interesting topic to dive into. I know it's not technically data-driven business, but if you look at just the ad spend that happened in the last election campaign, clearly it's pretty big business. Ray, did I cover everything, or is there a little bit you wanted to add on the background there? Don't forget your mic.
Working. Okay, yeah, that's pretty good.
Good. So we talked about this a little while ago in getting ready for this, but for the audience, how is your view of analytics and data in campaigns different from, say, Nate Silver's?
Yeah, I mean, I think the view, it's sort of, what Nate Silver is doing, and I'm assuming most people here are familiar with the polls that were happening and you know, every little thing that you guys were following, which we completely ignored. We didn't really care because from the outside, the polls were basically used to understand where the race is, who's winning, basically. Are we winning yet? Are we still winning? Are we still winning? From the inside, we cared a little bit about who's winning, but we cared a lot more about changing that number, and then more importantly, using that number to do resource allocation. So the fact that we were 49.9% likely to win in Florida meant that we could put a different amount of money there than if we were winning 50.1% or 48.4%. So I think that was sort of the key difference from the outside. Polling is trying to get a sense of where the race is. From the inside, we're trying to change that number, but at the same time, we're trying to use that number to really do very fine-grained resource allocation instead of just kind of watching that number change over time.
So at a very fundamental level, I'm going to ask you to make a judgment call. Is data science good or bad for democracy? I may have had some time to think about it.
This is an easy question, right? I'm here, so I have to say it's good for democracy. And I actually mean that, right? Like, I think we can sort of take the gun analogy, right, where you can use it any way you want. You can manipulate people, or you can inform people. And I think what at least the campaigns, you know, it's kind of difficult to manipulate hundreds of millions of people. So what you really do using data is try to figure out, you know, who's interested in what, and then highlight and amplify that message. So at least my personal hope is that the real use of data science in politics is really to figure out who's interested in what kind of content. It's very much like personalization for enterprises. And then inform them about how some policy issues affect them, and that makes them better informed, more engaged, more enthusiastic, increases number of people who vote, and eventually better for democracy. So it's a fairly easy answer for me, but I'm sure, you know, somebody here is going to say something, and I'd love to hear that argument.
Well, I can do devil's advocate pretty well. So there's a question here around how data science was used in the campaign. One of the interesting ones, if you talk to people who voted that day, is they often had 1, 2, even 3 Obama for America volunteers stop by and ask them if they voted or not. So you can you're kind of bringing this focus to nudging them in that direction or not. You could imagine in a more dystopian world where people might be nudged not to vote, or if it's a very close district, say perhaps in Ohio, there's some disincentive to target people not to vote or not. I mean, usually think about technology in these contexts as a somewhat neutral force. Is there any reason that data science couldn't be used to depress certain kinds of turnout as opposed to nudging others?
mean, as I said, I could play the same flip sides, but I actually fundamentally believe that it's much easier to convince to encourage people than to discourage people in general. Persuasion works a lot better towards positive things than negative things. So, for example, if you run two experiments, one says everybody's voting, your vote really matters, you should vote, versus not many people are voting, your vote really matters, you should vote. The first message works a lot better. There have been a lot of experiments. So that kind of shows you positive reinforcement and sort of encouraging people is much, much, much easier than negative. So overall, you can use it for both things, but I think it's much more effective and frankly easier to do to sort of increase turnout than try to selectively decrease turnout.
Okay.
What was the most counterintuitive finding that you came across during the campaign?
Question. I mean, I don't think there was sort of something that was absolutely counterintuitive in terms of sort of we looked at data, we discovered something, and that was I think the campaign was a lot more about how do you operationalize analytics instead of a lot of people looking at data and trying to find a little piece, sort of the 20-year-old the nugget type things. It was how do you take something at scale, operationalize it, deploy it to millions of volunteers who could then do something with it, act on it, make phone calls, do door knocks. We could send emails, do online ads, do TV ads, all based on the same. So I don't think we were kind of looking at one of the interesting sort of things that happened that was really good and bad was it was not counterintuitive, more reassuring. Was the first so the campaign, the polls, we were doing really well, and then the first debate happened, and our numbers kind of went down. One of the things that happened is we after a few days, we wanted to kind of leave. Who were the people who we lost support? And it turned out, so what we were doing is we're predicting the likelihood of every individual in the country of being persuaded to vote for Obama. And that's how we would sort of make our list to call people and persuade them. Turned out the people who had switched when we did our polling and built our models were pretty much the people we had predicted were persuadable. So it was very unfortunate that we were right about who were the persuadable people, but it was also fortunate that we knew exactly who they were so we could see if we could do something about it. So it wasn't a counterintuitive, but it was sort of a more reassuring, wow, we didn't really think it was going to be so accurate that these people would switch to the other side even before the elections happened.
So for the business
So wait,
focus...
you just said that the debate didn't matter because those guys were going to leave anyway. I just want to...
No, they weren't. So they weren't going to leave anyway. We were basically scoring everybody between 0 and 100 in terms of persuadability. And people who were 100, we were trying to have conversations with them to persuade them to vote for us. Now, what's not clear, if you go to the retail analogy, is brand switching, right? What's not clear is if they switch to your brand, are they going to switch back to the other one if they get a better deal? In politics, the better deal might be, somebody goes and convinces them or something big happens. So what's often not clear is and so what was counterintuitive for us was that were they going to switch just to us and it wasn't a symmetric switching, or was it actually a symmetric switching? It turns out for many of those people, they did switch back, or they weren't switched over. They're just kind of on the boundary. So we did do a lot of more research trying to figure out what really happens there. But I think that's the beginning of sort of an interesting area, both for campaigns, but also for businesses, when you're trying to persuade people to do something, your customers, your clients, especially in the consumer, if you're dealing with millions of people, how do you do that? How do you run experiments, and how do you sort of see how long-term the effects are? We sort of did some interesting things that could be a beginning of sort of good techniques to do that.
Yeah, sure. You answered part of it. I think one of the questions I have in the context of business, you're trying to move people to buy things, right? Or, that's the needle you're trying to move. Here, it's trying to get people to register and then turn out to vote. In terms of thinking about the ways that you do that, are there some differences in terms of how you communicate, in terms of, specifically how you use the data too, or collect the data, store the data, or subsequently release it or not?
I mean, I think what we do is, I'm a computer scientist, and not a politician. But what the political campaign does is significantly broader than what a retail business does, right? So a retailer at different points in time has different goals. Sometimes it's maximizing margin. Sometimes it's revenue. Sometimes it's market share. Sometimes this might be, a new product comes out. You want to have but they're all kind of doing that at different times for different products. What a campaign is doing is kind of doing a lot of different things at the same time. And we only have one product. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to raise money. So we're basically selling them some idea that they have to, but it's not the same as selling a product. Now, we were able to sell $40 iPhone cases to people. That a business is rarely able to do because we weren't selling that item. We were selling something more than that. We were asking for help and support in building this organization. So we're raising money. We're recruiting volunteers. We're registering people to vote. We're persuading people to vote for us. We're getting them to go and actually go and vote. And I think what's sort of challenging is separating out different things you can ask people because you don't want to ask them for everything all the time. And so the way we had to structure ourselves differently is think about who are the people who are most helpful in achieving these goals. And then we knew we as an organization couldn't do most of it. Again, most retailers, they do everything themselves. If you manufacture, you need a retailer. But if you're a campaign, you don't only need a few thousand people in your organization, you need 1 million people outside doing most of the work for you. So a lot of it was sort of building an organization that we had to think about very differently. How do we use data to really create enthusiasm, to create engagement? And then, and of course what's necessary is having, not a product, but a candidate who is actually able to create that. And without that, you can't really do all the other work. So I think there were a lot of different goals, different challenges, a lot of personalization that we had to do that it's difficult to do in a different industry.
Well, you hit on two big challenges in the last discussion. One is you're building a user interface for millions of people. So that puts serious constraints on how much sophistication you can put in. Are there features you would have loved to put in the tools, but you just sort of went, there's no way we can do that, it'll confuse people too much? How do you balance that, the right tool versus the tool the masses can use, sort of, analytics for the unwashed millions? How did that work?
Yeah, I mean, that was a constant struggle because sort of we had a lot of things we would have loved to do because we thought that would help us win, but the trade-off was we had to freeze a lot of our systems pretty early on. It had to be used by millions of people. It had to be not just the actual computer system. So you think of campaign. A lot of the campaign happens online. Most of it happens offline, and those two things need to connect to each other. You can't have, and again, that's for most businesses. You need to connect your online and offline worlds. But one of the big challenges we had was even very simple. Most of the offline actions that are taken by volunteers are making phone calls or door knocks, and you have to train them to do certain things. You can't have very subtle, differentiated messages. To this person, you should say that. To this person, you should say that. It has to be pretty much the same message. So we almost had to find a global optima that worked well enough for everyone that you could train people pretty easily. Because the training was done by individuals in neighborhoods and small teams. So that was on the offline side. On the online side, I mean, when we were building what we call a call tool, which was supposed to be the tool where you go in and you get a phone number and a script, and you call somebody and convince them to do something, we really wanted to put a lot of sophistication in there. We wanted to go, who's the right person to call this person? How many times should this person be called? What message should we send this person? What about if they make a phone call and they put down the phone too quickly? Maybe that meant that that wasn't the right person. Can we infer a lot of these interactions, infer things from these interactions?
So did you actually measure time to hang up?
We didn't, right? Because there were all this was sort of a wish list, right? In the beginning, we had a long wish list of things, and then slowly we started cutting things down because it was going to be too complicated for users to really deal with. So it's sort of the personalization is easier to implement if you don't have a human in the middle.
Did volunteers make calls with their mobile phone or with their home phone?
It depends. So we had a web-based tool that you could get a phone number and you can call from anywhere you want, or you could go to a physical office in a phone bank and use your cell phone, or we had cell phones over there.
Because it seems to me that if you could just build an app and they can use that to dial, you could start to analyze voice tone, call duration, number of dials and,
Absolutely.
instrument the device they're using to make the phone call.
Absolutely. And
2016, right?
Yep, that's the hope. There are a lot of these things you can do. We started doing some basic things where even connecting the two online and offline worlds of somebody, if a volunteer talked to a person and they wrote down they're kind of persuadable and they're interested in these type of things, as soon as that text went into the computer, we could analyze that text and figure out they're persuadable, interested in topic X. It would trigger an email with a video from Barack Obama talking about that issue and say, hey, you just met this volunteer, thanks for taking the time. So just very simple connection things. Even that took us, a year to get to the point where we could even try doing it with a few states that we piloted things with. So just the scale makes a lot, the timing that we had, a year and a half to create an organization, figure out what we're building, build it, deploy it. At that scale, a lot of things had to be very simple, and there were all these constraints that we had to kind of live with.
So I received a lot of email from you all, and a lot of people did. And some of the subject lines got people wondering about how effective different ones were. And sometimes there were things like, hey, hi, what's up? Which is an unusual thing to be getting from the president's campaign. Were those really the most effective lines? What did the data show you there?
Yeah, the email was actually interesting and frustrating at the same time because I kept getting emails from all of my friends. Like, why are you sending me so many emails? Stop sending me emails. Why? And
Wait, you're complaining because you got a lot of emails.
No, well, I had a folder where I was, putting them on the side.
So did we.
Apparently not enough of you were doing that. If enough of you were doing that, we wouldn't have kept sending you emails. So the best way to stop getting emails is to stop responding to the emails.
That's true with spam too, by the way.
Exactly. If you don't click on it, you don't reinforce the system that's sending it. And then, but I'm glad a lot of people did click on them, and I'm glad a lot of people paid or donated money because that was certainly helpful. But everything was. So when I got to the campaign, after the first few months, I realized we're sending too many emails. We possibly can't sustain this because we'll lose people. So we ran some experiments that reduced the email frequency. So we held out, we took a few 100,000 people and reduced the frequency at different levels. We halved it and we made it to 0 for a couple of months. And my personal hope was that if we do that, if we're nice to people, they'll respond. When we start slowly sending them emails again, they'll kind of come back and start giving emails, start giving money. Turned out we lost money in those experiments. People didn't feel appreciated by, if we didn't send them emails. So then the obvious thing was, we have to try sending more emails. Like if reducing it is losing us money, then I have to try this, at least as an experiment. So we did that experiment. Turned out when we sent people more email, they gave more money. And not just a little bit more money, pretty much our analysis was, our experiments that we ran showed us we made about 10 to 15% more money for every incremental email a day. If you're $1 billion campaign, that is a lot of money to sort of leave on the table because you don't want to send an additional email. So then, very painfully, I had to recommend we basically send more email. And so, again, I felt bad in the beginning, but then I did what I could, and turns out people want more email. And if you want more email, we'll give you more email.
So, about optimization of subject lines, the angry Joe Biden emails, did you test those out?
Some of the emails that went out there were two kinds of tests we were running. Some of them were sort of long-term tests that I just talked about that were the more enlightening ones where what do we really do in the long term? Some of them were basically simple A/B tests, right? So the subject line type things were often done as A/B tests on the morning of. So if we wanted to send an email, we would write 10 different variations with different subject lines, different messages, different senders maybe, take samples of 50,000 or something people each, send 10 different emails, look at the response rates, and pick the one that did the best. So in those things, a lot of times these hey and hi and what's up and things would do really well. But I think we were also very clear that some of these effects are basic novelty effects. So you can't keep sending the same thing over and over. And when we looked at we would also analyze attributes of emails, such as, is it a positive tone, negative tone, is it short, long, who's the sender, what kind of messages, is it policy versus selling you a bumper sticker, and then try to break up different behavioral demographic attributes to see what kind of emails are being responded to by different by these different demographic and behavioral attributes. So a lot of it was there was a lot of data behind it, and we were lucky we had a very large mailing list that we could run all these experiments on. Most people can't do that. So some of this testing, it was all done either every email that went was most of them went there for a reason. Most of them went out for a reason. But if you got an email, you could have been in a test group. So what you don't know is the email that's coming to you, was that a test email? So if you got one really early morning, Central Time, it was a test email typically. Or if you went around noon or 2 o'clock, that was an afternoon test email. If you got it in the later batch, you were the one that was the one that won email.
So that begs a question about data warfare, because you just told me stuff like, if I know it comes in the morning, I'm part of a test group, right? If you're in web analytics, I can go to your website with a spurious UTM_value, and I can pollute your analytics. If I know that you're testing for optimization, if I know that you're doing this stuff, where's the data warfare going to happen? Because we talk about gerrymandering a district, but what if I get a bunch of mails from the Obama campaign and then I respond in a certain way that steers you down the wrong path and reduces your effectiveness? It seems like there's a way of doing some very underhanded sort of digital gerrymandering where I go in and confuse your analytical data or pollute it to the point that your ability to raise money is compromised. Did that ever happen, and how would you defend against it?
Yeah, we honestly we had bigger things to worry about, so we weren't really worried about. We were looking at some of these things. If we saw really strange patterns of that, then we would look at what's happening if certain IP addresses ranges were doing certain interesting things, lots of clicks, things like that. But enough people have to do that for it to be have an effect, and if you do it right in the limit, it's very hard to defend against that. If you're smart and you have a good network and you can really fool. And if you can get into our mailing list with different enough IP addresses and enough people, and every test group, you could certainly change the online email strategy. I think what's not clear is how easy it is to do, and then how much. It really varies. The optimizations that happen are not generally consistent over time. So the patterns of the optimizations change over time. So it's very hard for us to really figure out if what's working today is also going to work in a week or in a month, especially when elections change significantly. Right? So this time around was the first time ever where both candidates were not taking public financing. So a lot of the things we were doing were very different. The patterns were very different. It was very different from 2008, where there were primaries going on. So everything that was happening was driven by primaries. So the last time an incumbent ran was Bush, and that time nobody took public financing. So the fundraising behaviors and predictions are so different over time that it's very hard. If you're going to game something, I think you should game something else. Campaign fundraising emails and online strategies are going to be. They're so rare that you don't have enough data about them to really use data-driven things to game the system.
So what should you game? Since you mentioned it.
Maybe Amazon and Groupon emails. You have a lot more consistency.
Oh, you mean I should game other people's emails, not another aspect of the campaign?
Yeah. Okay. Well, yeah. If you're trying to learn how to sort of do data warfare with optimization, online optimizations, you really want to go after people who are consistently doing the same thing over and over and over again, where they can really go down different paths.
So there's an awful lot of focus on social data, because people see that and something they actually have experience with. But from what we know, the campaign was using a lot of other data sources too. Can you list some of the places, or even all the places that you pulled data into, and the kind of picture that enabled you to draw of a given voter?
When I sort of read in the media about what data we were using, most of it is really you think we're using that, because we didn't really have a lot of interesting data. We had so our database, the main source, the master data was basically what's called a voter file, which is every voter in the country, it's public data, every voter, registered voter in the country, their demographics, whatever you guys fill out in the voter registration form. Voting history is public, so we know which elections you've voted in. We don't know which way you voted. So that's our main data source, right? From there, we attach other things to it, such as if we do some polling, we call people and ask them, do you support Romney or Obama? So we'll attach that if they said Romney or Obama. We'll attach fundraising data if you gave us money. We'll attach, volunteer if you signed up to volunteer, if you did something. We'll add to it if you, anytime a volunteer calls somebody and has a conversation, they might take down notes saying this person wasn't home, or they've left, that this number is not valid anymore, or this person is interested. So that's the kind of data we have. We have data that we collect ourselves, our interactions with them, fundraising, volunteering, email history. So if you're one of the few tens of millions of people who are subscribed to a mailing list, we have that data, and all these things kind of come together. The social data exists. We didn't really use a lot of social data. So for a lot of people, social data is an input where you take this data and you listen, you listen, right? For us, most of the people who we're trying to work with or our channels really weren't that social, right? And so the way we use social networks, though, was in a very different way. So one of the things we realized in the campaign that we had a hard time reaching younger people with these types of traditional channels. So, phone calls and door knocks and direct mail and TV ads. Most younger people don't use those channels. So we had a hard time reaching them. And one of the things we built was basically a tool that used Facebook to get people and sort of use their social networks to try to target them with who are the people you should really share this particular content with. So if you are right now looking at some content that's about voter registration, I can ask you for your, so Obama for America is asking for authorization to access your friend list and your profile and your stream, and you give this permission. We look at your friend list and we try to figure out, of the people in your friend list, who are likely to be not registered to vote. So we can combine it with our data, give some likelihood of not being registered, and then who are the people who are likely to vote for Obama if registered, and then some sort of an influence score of how likely are to influence this person. So we ran a lot of experiments and tried to figure out how to calculate those scores. And at the end, we were able to give sort of a list of 10 people, 12 people, who are likely not registered, likely Obama voters, and can be influenced by you. So that's sort of the kind of way we sort of took a lot of the data and used social networks as a channel to basically do organizing as people do, as traditional campaigns have done offline. Instead of you going door to door, we can get to these people online. We don't need a lot of people. We had about 1 million people using this tool in the last 3 months, and we were able to sort of 1 million was not a large number for us, but that opens up a network of 200 million people around them that we could get to and ask them to do very specific things with that network.
Did you score every one of those 200 million people?
We scored as many of the people as we could. And scoring, it's not a lot of detailed data on Facebook, on your friend list. You've got your name, your city, state, your age, and gender, and that's mostly it what you can get. But if we can match people to our voter list, we can get more data. Most people have fairly generic names, by definition, right? So if you have a simple name, John Smith in Cincinnati, there are a lot of you, so we can't really individually identify you. So we can still build a model that's better than random, that predicts your likelihood of doing a lot of things. But yeah, so we tried to score as many people as we could, and then use them, and then ask people to do what we call targeted sharing.
Could you crawl their public profile and then say, like, I'm going to do facial recognition or visual cues on, I'm going to look for correlation. People that have golden retrievers in their pictures are more likely to vote Republican. I don't know.
We didn't, and we could. I mean, a lot of it was and we had to make a lot of these decisions of what can we do first legally, and so in the Facebook case, we only used the data that we were authorized to use by the user who was authorizing us, and so if that person is sharing only 3 things with them, that's all we access. We can't access anything more. But I think also there's
a substantial amount of stuff that's now part of a public profile once you know the person's there that you can crawl legally, right?
Right, you can. What I don't know is what the terms of use are for using that, right? So just because you can crawl it doesn't mean you can use it for something. And we were very, very conscious of terms of use for different things because we just didn't want to do anything that we weren't allowed to do. So, and a lot of these websites have terms of use are very different than what you can technically do on them.
So here's a strategic question. There's been a lot of chewing over of the campaign's approaches to IT after the campaign. There's been some fairly well publicized issues with the Romney campaign's data collection platform Orca on the day of, and that's all out there to go look at. But I think the broader question is how much of a strategic advantage was it for you to be able to use the database internally and do calls against it as opposed to have that be outside of the campaign in any way? Are you having conversations now about what that enabled you to do? How important was it to have that infrastructure that Harper Reid and everyone else built?
Yeah, I mean, the infrastructure we had built started in 2010, right? So it wasn't for this campaign. DNC had invested a lot of money and effort in creating an infrastructure that, and that was a priority for them right then because they realized it was a disaster before. And it wasn't having a database. It basically was we had 10 different vendors with 15 different kinds of databases. Pick every database that you've seen. We had a copy of it running with some vendor. And so having all of that come into one place that we could build inside, and then DNC did a great job of sort of building that, and then not just sort of getting it in, but having every 15 minutes basically syncing the databases, having it all inside up to date, so we could run all our analysis in one place because before it wasn't possible to do, but then also syncing it back, right? So we had to get data back into those source systems because the information was being consumed over there. So our phone calls were being made from the tool that was outside. Our emails were being sent from a vendor that was, again, outside. So having a system that was pulling stuff in, letting us do our work, and then pushing the results out in an automated way continuously, it was a huge difference. We couldn't have done a lot of the things we did, most of them, as effectively as we did if we didn't have that. Now, we were also lucky we had a year and a half of lead time. We had an incumbent. We could build an organization, and we had the money to really build something that could do all that. You can't just do it in the last 3 months of a campaign. So I think it was we had a head start that really helped us get to that point.
It's a good business lesson for people. We've had a couple of questions submitted via Twitter, but if you guys want to raise your hand and ask them now, we got time for one or two. We got more, obviously. Yes, in the back, sir. Yell it loudly so we can hear it, please. Okay, so can you tell us a little about what kind of machine learning algorithms are actually used in practice?
This is a business talk. I'm not trying to talk about no. Sure. How much? So we tried everything that was out there. For everything we did, we did everything ranging from, we did a lot of sort of logistic regression. We did SVMs for a lot of things. We tried decision trees. We tried a lot of Bayesian stuff. We tried anything you can think of. Like for the network stuff, we tried a lot of propagation algorithms. So that's my background, right? I've done machine learning for as far back as I can remember in my adult life. It often turns out when you do these kind of things that your external constraints end up dominating your choices, right? So in our case, the constraints were, in some cases, we had to be able to train and test very quickly with hundreds of millions of rows and tons of columns. That meant you need a linear classifier. That meant you had to use and linear SVMs were basically the only thing that you could do in 5 seconds. Other constraints were we had a lot of people who had economics and political science backgrounds who had used a particular, let's say, stata in their lives. You could retrain them to use something else, but we didn't have the time or the interest into retraining them. So they used whatever algorithms they were comfortable with in regression because they could sit down and really tweak it by hand. Some of the things we had to build with, we only had 5 columns to build some models. In that case, we used KXEN, which was just get a bunch of models out really quickly. It doesn't matter if they're 85 or 87% accurate. So based on the external constraints, we would sort of pick the right algorithm, and sometimes it'd be the best one in terms of performance, it'd be best in terms of ease of use or speed up to train, speed to test, speed to deploy, all those type of things. but happy to talk afterwards more detail about those things.
It's interesting, the sort of shameless idealism that you could do all this stuff and everybody thinks you're crawling everyone's Facebook profiles, and you're actually like, no, we just use this thing because that's all we could do. So the reality of constraints seems to be a huge factor here. So tell me about the resistance you encountered internally. I know we discussed some of this, but if I'm running a test on who clicks ads and someone doesn't click it, I don't really care. But, oh my goodness, I might send a voter to the other side. We can't possibly do that. I mean, you're dealing with a test model here where inevitably some people are going to be grist for the testing mill, hopefully for the greater good of the campaign. How do you deal with that kind of resistance?
Yeah, that's actually a good question, because in theory, we had an organization that was very much bought into the testing world. Like they believed testing was the right thing to do. But that when you actually got to specific tests, they were like, oh, no, we can't do that. So when we said, oh, we should send an extra email every day, like, oh, we can't do that. That would make people change their minds. Like, okay, well, let's reduce the number of emails. Oh, we can't do that, then we'll lose money. Like, so magically, we've got this perfect number of emails that we send because we know this is the right number, and reducing it would mean losing money. Increasing it would mean turning away people. So that there is, in other cases when we were doing a lot of other work where we can't, if we use this. So basically, what we had to do was a couple things. One is we had to take our time and kind of show them what we could do and basically prove it to them using results on smaller samples. It would take, okay, give us these people and we can try something here. The second thing we have to do is basically run a lot of head-to-head tests. So if you think this is a better way, we think this is the better way. Let's run these two and see what happens. And most often, we would start seeing better results. So I think that in general we were really lucky because overall organization was much more testing, I wouldn't say centered, but at least savvy and accepted testing as a word. As an actual implementation, I think there were challenges where people wouldn't know what does that mean. Should I test everything? Should I test the font color and the font size, and should I underline and highlighting and all? So it didn't really translate into prioritizing those tests, figuring out what the effect of those tests would be if successful. So one of the things we weren't really good at as an organization is we would sometimes run tests that would not be, the sample size wouldn't be large enough to detect the effect that we would want it to detect. Right? So we'd say, hey, the effect size we're looking for is about 0.5%. That means your sample size is going to be, in this case, 20,000 people. And people would run tests that were only 10,000 people. And the result would come back as saying, they're both the same. Well, no, they're not both the same. Your test you ran didn't have enough people in there. And so it was basically a wasted test. And so we started from that world where we tried to get more and more educate people on what does it mean to run a good test. What are you trying to detect? 95% significance, that's not a magic number. You can move that based on your cost and based on what you... So there was a lot of education involved in the campaign, and we eventually got to a much better place than we started.
Any other questions right there?
Yeah, one more quick question. Sir.
With respect to your data model, you're gathering data from people from so many different areas that they don't realize it's coming from. At some point, don't you get to a critical mass of personal data where the terms of use necessarily need to change? Or a person would like to opt out of that because you effectively gathered a very personal view of who they are in your data model?
So just to repeat the question, at some point you gather enough individually non-private data that when you marry it together, it breaches an implied terms of service for privacy because now the aggregate tells you more than you're comfortable with.
I mean, I think at some point you reach that. We were nowhere close to that. The data we had wasn't very interesting and detailed, right? It's fairly basic demographics. In my business life, I've had a lot more and orders more detailed and complex data about individuals. So I don't think the campaigns are anywhere close to knowing enough about you to reach that point. I agree that there is that point where, you can connect enough pieces together. I don't think we're anywhere close to that. Many other businesses are in a much advanced stage of doing that. Now, there's also the challenge, which we struggled with quite a bit, is and most customer-facing businesses do, is integration, right? How do you match? You call it customer data integration or matching or record linkage or all sorts of things. It's how do you say this person's the same as that person? And that's where things get challenging, because often you might link them incorrectly, and you might expose some of that to the person you think it's linked to on some sort of a front end. So we were very careful also about that user-facing part, is let's not expose something to people that might be private, or that may be considered private, because we may have done this matching wrong. We got this from here and this from here, and we thought this is the same person. So there are a lot of other things that are almost as important as sort of, the perceived privacy. It's also what are you letting people see. But I think campaigns aren't anywhere close to having detailed data right now to be really focused on that.
Alex, any closing thoughts?
Well, sure. I guess last one, since I get the opportunity. There's been a lot more interest around behavioral economics, behavioral science, and certainly interesting to think about how and where that could be applied. Was that something that you were doing in the campaign here? And if so, again, what implications does it have for a democracy to be nudging people in those directions? Is it something we should be doing if it gets people to vote more, or is it necessarily too invasive?
Yeah, I mean, we were doing a lot of experiments that tests that were trying to figure out what convinces people to do certain things. So what convinces them to give more money? What convinces them to volunteer to do something? What convinces them to register to vote and to vote for us? And all that requires basically the kind of things you're talking about. You require data, but you also need interesting hypotheses that you can run. What should that test be? My personal view there is, I think it has to do two things. It has to make people better informed, and then it has to make people vote. If both of those two things happen, I think it's good for democracy. I don't think just plain voting is good for democracy. I think informed voting, and what I'm curious about is what happens in Australia. You look at and you force people to vote. I haven't looked at enough data to really know what happens. What's the effect of sort of forced compulsory voting? Does education matter? There's a large percent of people who leave the ballots blank. Have people done surveys of those people, and sort of what does that mean, and what happens there? So I think personally, I'm interested. I mean, what I'm kind of moving towards next in my sort of professional life is taking the same kind of techniques and trying to use them for sort of social good. Like, how do you do the same thing in education? How do you do the same thing in healthcare? Where if you can come up with predictions of who are the people at risk of doing certain things, how do you influence them? How do you persuade them through social media, through other channels? And I think some of that there, you would have no argument that, well, if this is good for them, if you can get them to graduate college at a higher rate, or graduate high schools at a higher rate, or apply to the high schools, or change their behavior so child obesity goes down, there wouldn't be much argument about, well, does data good? If you use data for that, is that good or bad? I think the outcome sort of often is going to sort of tell people whether it's the right thing to do or not. So looking forward to that world, hopefully.
All right, one last quick question. Don't put Mike down. So what's your biggest prediction for what will be different in 2016?
There will be 2 primaries in 2016. I think it's going to be a very different election. It's going to
Obama's not changing term limits? I heard that was...
I don't know. We have to bring Clinton back for that. I think it's going to be a very different election. I don't think it'll be as sophisticated as this time, mostly because you're not going to have the time to really build an infrastructure. And so you might have to sort of, a lot of the things from this time around will need to be rebuilt. So I think data will still play a part. Hopefully, it'll be at an even playing field. So data is not the big differentiator. It's the policies and the actions that matter. That's my hope. But it's always going to be, we'll see what happens in the next couple of years.
I think the DNC feels the same way.
I don't speak for the DNC.
All right, Rayid, thank you. I'm selfishly have taken 15 more minutes of your afternoon than I said I would. Rayid, thank you so much for getting up here and chatting with us. And thank you, Alex, for fielding questions online.